Armada. Now, who can tell me what the word Spanish means? What's Spanish? Well, something from Spain. Okay, that's easy. But what about the word Armada? What is an Armada? Yeah, it's a large fleet of ships. Okay, good. And I actually use the F word here. Flotilla. It's a large flotilla of warships. Now, you don't have to write this part here down. Now, the Spanish Armada was this flotilla of warships cruising toward England to destroy it. So, Spanish warships were going to England to destroy it. Why? Why was Spain mad at England? Well, it had to do with their kings. King Philip of Spain had started to get all of this gold coming into his country. And the King of England also wanted to have this rival sea power too, and also wanted to send people to the New World to get the gold too. It was this rivalry. Now what had happened was that the King of England, his name was Henry VIII, and he was Catholic. The King of England was Catholic. But guess what? The King of England, Henry VIII right here, married the sister of the King of Spain. Sometimes they intermarried like that. The king of one, a princess, they'd intermarry to unite in marriage so that one country won't attack the other one. And so what happened was that the King of England married the sister of the King of Spain. So she comes over, Spanish queen comes over and rules with him. Well, she was 38 years old. He was 18. It's a little off, but he desired a male son. She produced two girls, Mary and Elizabeth. And he really wanted a male heir. Well, she was getting older and older and couldn't produce another child, and so he divorced her. Well, that ticked off the Pope and her brother, who was the King of Spain. And since the Pope said, no, you can't divorce her, he says, well, I'm going to start my own religion. And he started the English Protestant religion, the Anglican Church. And so they broke away. And now we've got this Christian holy war going on. Catholics from Spain attacking England. And that's what the Spanish Armada was really kind of all about. They were rivals in sea power, in gold power, and that kind of money thing, but they were also rivals in Christian and Protestant. This is the first Christian and Protestant war that we have. And we've got many. There's 50 of them in Europe in the next 200 years. And it's going to be England against Spain. Was that this king, this Spanish king, sent this great flotilla of warships. There's over 130 ships. And I'm not talking about just a little boat. I'm not talking about a little fishing boat, cargo vessel boat. I'm talking about a warship where you've got 9 guns, 9 cannons on the top deck. Just below it, 9 more cannons on the other deck. On the other side, you got 9 cannons, 9 more cannons. 36 cannons in all. 120 men set out on your boat just to work the cannons. That's quite a ship. They had 130 of these ships. This is an impressive fleet. There is no way England should have won this battle. There is no way that Spain is going to get defeated here. He's got so much money coming into the empire. Look at this. 30,000 men went with them, went on some of these other ships. And they were going to sail up the Thames River in England and attack London and kill the queen. By this time, Henry had died, and since he didn't have a male heir, Queen Elizabeth became queen. He wanted to eliminate their chief rival, England. He built this impressive flotilla of ships. Today, we call it the Spanish Armada. Sir Francis Drake, anytime you name Sir right there, Sir Francis Drake, he was knighted and led the English against the Spanish. And so the Armada is going to sail through the English Channel. Now, the English Channel is this narrow little strip of water in between France and England. It's right here. And as the Spanish fleet approaches, they set out, little watchtowers. They fire up little watchtowers along the way, saying the Spanish are coming. They're going to sail up the Thames River and attack London right here. So the English are getting ready. Well, it just so happens that there was a great storm that arose, a tempest, and it began to tear at some of the sails of the Spanish ships. They were so heavy and so clumsy that the winds just pushed them into the rocks, and it broke up the ships, and the men drowned. It didn't happen to all the ships, but nearly 2/3 of all the Spanish ships were destroyed. And as they keep sailing around England here, the English are attacking them with smaller ships, easier to maneuver in the English Channel. And by the time they got around Ireland and headed back to Spain, they never did attack England. They limped back to port with about 30 ships. Only about 1,000 men survived. And when Philip saw this fleet, this giant armada limping back to port, he said, I sent my ships to attack England. I did not send them to attack the winds and waves of God. And This is going to lead us to our historical significance of the Spanish Armada. Remember, each one of these explorers have a historical significance. There's a reason why we study about Magellan 500 years later. And so there is a great historical significance with the Spanish Armada. This is a little battle that took place. And this particular battle that took place, while it didn't go very well for Spain, you would think, oh, why are we learning it in U.S. history? We find this answer right here when we talk about the Spanish Armada. And this is the reason why Mr. Cap is talking about it some 500 years later. It's the fact that ever since the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, England is going to increase in power and Spain is going to decrease in power. And this is cool because that's why we speak it in English. We don't speak Espanol in this classroom. We are of English heritage, not Spanish. You see, had Spain conquered England, Spain would have had that exploration advantage. And we still might be a colony of Spain today. Spain might still be a world power today. They're not today. And so England is going to increase in power and Spain is going to decrease.
1558. The massive Spanish Empire is poised to encircle the globe. With lands that range from Madrid to Macau, Habsburg King Philip II rules as the most powerful sovereign in the world.
It's with the conquest of the Philippines, which began in 1565, that one can say that the empire was one in which the sun never set. The addition of the Portuguese realms to it, of course, rounds it out. But once you've got the Philippines on the far side of the globe, you've got such an empire.
The staunchly religious King Philip II attempts to bring all Catholic nations under one umbrella. Part of his strategy includes marrying the Catholic Queen of England, Mary Tudor, a calculated move intended to provide some protection for Philip's Dutch holdings against a French invasion.
One of the big attractions of marrying Mary Tudor, a woman much older than Philip, probably beyond the childbearing age, but nevertheless the ruler of the country on the other side of the Netherlands. So uniting England and the Netherlands provided a safety net on the other side.
At her new husband Philip's urging, Queen Mary begins amassing a modern navy. She christens the first new ship, Philip and Mary, in honor of their union. But trouble is on the horizon. Queen Mary is dying of ovarian cancer. When Mary's half-sister, Elizabeth I, takes control of the throne in 1558, she immediately begins reverting England to a Protestant regime. In a last-ditch attempt to stop the change, Philip shocks the world by proposing to Elizabeth.
Believe me, if it were not for God's sake, I would never do this. Nothing could or would make me do this except the clear knowledge that it might gain the kingdom of England for his service and faith.
Elizabeth rebuffs her reluctant suitor, and Philip returns to Spain, temporarily abandoning all hopes of keeping Catholicism alive in England.
Philip and Elizabeth coexist reasonably well for the first 10 years of their reign. And then Francis Drake and John Hawkins come back from the Caribbean to England and say, we have been attacked by the Spaniards.
For several years, English Captain John Hawkins and his young protege Francis Drake have plied a lucrative slave trade route between Africa and the Spanish towns in the Americas, much to the chagrin of King Philip.
Technically, these people were pirates, and not many of them had any real authority from Elizabeth, even if she invested in their voyages. Drake claimed to have had the Queen's okay, but never shows it to anybody. So, in effect, the Spaniards regard this as pure piracy.
When storms force Hawkins' battered ships to seek shelter in a Mexican port, the Spanish Navy seizes the opportunity to spring a trap on the unsuspecting Englishmen.
Hawkins and some of his men were just barely able to escape to one of the other ships called the Minion, and Drake himself got into a very small ship, and Hawkins sent him orders, come back, I've got too many men on this ship and I want you to take some of them off. Well, Drake didn't come back, and he went off by himself and left Hawkins with his overloaded ship to make his own way out of the harbor.
Standing by her pirate captains, Elizabeth retaliates for the attack on the English ships by taking 5 Spanish treasure galleons hostage. A furious King Philip begins plotting a way to depose Elizabeth's reign. He unexpectedly receives the perfect opportunity in 1570 when Pope Pius V excommunicates the Queen. Ridolfi's intricate plan to kill Elizabeth and replace her with the Catholic Queen of Scotland, Mary Stuart, intrigues Philip. He pledges an invasion force to support the insurrection, but never gets to unleash it. Elizabeth's spies uncover the plot.
She arrests the conspirators. After the Ridolfi plot, Elizabeth is prepared to support any opponent of Philip II.
Elizabeth begins openly providing money and soldiers to the Dutch in their fight against Spain. She further implements a campaign to attack Philip where he is most vulnerable, in his pocketbook. Beginning in 1572, Elizabeth unleashes Hawkins and Drake in a series of pirating expeditions. They brazenly plunder Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, capturing countless rich prizes. Francis Drake gains an almost mythical reputation among the Spanish for his feats of skill and daring.
When they sent their reports back home, they didn't report that we've had an English pirate stop here and burn town. They would say, we've had the worst pirate imaginable stop here. He's not only a pirate and an English pirate, but it's Drake, the Dragon, El Drago.
While Philip sends a huge fleet to hunt Drake down, the wily mariner turns west and returns to England by circumnavigating the earth, the first Englishman ever to accomplish this incredible feat.
We call it circumnavigation. It is a record of very successful plunder, attack, assassination and capture carried out by Drake around the world, always at Philip II's expense.
Philip seethes with each new report of an English attack, but resists making a decisive response. The king is finally forced to take action in 1585 when Drake raids the Spanish ports of Galicia, reportedly desecrating churches and attacking priests and nuns.
This is war, and Philip II immediately writes to the Pope and says, I'm ready now, Your Holiness, to do what you asked me before. I will depose Elizabeth, and I will do it now.
May 25th, 1588. Medina Sidonia sends a messenger off to the Duke of Parma, commander of the Spanish land forces in the Netherlands, informing him that the Grand Armada is setting sail. He recommends that Parma begin preparing his troops for their rendezvous and subsequent invasion of Protestant England. Christened La Armada Felicissima, or the Most Fortunate Fleet, and flying the flag of Catholic Crusade, King Philip considers his flotilla invincible, protected by the hand of God.
His instructions to the Armada all emphasize the sacred enterprise in which the fleet is engaged. He makes special provision that there should be no blasphemy, no sodomy, no women on board, nothing that could possibly compromise the religious tone of the whole enterprise.
Fate soon mysteriously puts Philip's belief to a test, as the Armada encounters violent, unseasonable squalls. By June 24th, they have only reached the northern port of Corunna when a huge storm hits, scattering the ships. In a letter to the king, Medina Sidonia questions whether God is truly with the expedition, causing Philip to angrily respond.
I have dedicated this enterprise to God. Pull yourself together then, and do your part.
July 29th, 1588. Warning beacons flare across the English countryside, proclaiming that the Armada has been sighted just off the coast. There is a famous story that Sir Francis Drake is bowling on Plymouth Hoe when the news reaches him, and that the captain haughtily replies,
"We have enough time to finish the game and beat the Spaniards too."
Like David meeting Goliath, the English ships come at the Armada tentatively, choosing one Spanish ship on the fringes of the formation to pummel with a far-off cannonade. The San Juan de Portugal, flagship of second-in-command Juan Martinez de Recalde, experiences the first assault, receiving more than 300 hits. Although the distant fire does little real damage, Recalde fears that the Spanish hodgepodge of guns is no match for the superior English firepower.
Since our Mediterranean ships do not carry as much heavy artillery as the enemy, the latter will get closer and cause them some damage.
Recalde's ship survives the first day's battle, but other Spanish ships are not as fortunate. Medina Sidonia grasps at his last desperate option. He will anchor the Armada in the hazardous tide race off of Calais and wait for Parma's troops to arrive by barge. If he can just hold out long enough, the commander knows that a rendezvous still might be obtained and victory achieved.
The fate of the Tudor state hangs in the balance for 36 hours. It's only the English fleet which stands between the Armada and the invasion. There are no fortifications between the coast of Kent, where Parma intended to land, and London. And I believe under an experienced commander like Parma, they would have captured London and perhaps even taken the Queen too.
English Admiral Charles Howard recognizes that the entire balance of victory hangs on his next decision. He must strike a decisive blow. He decides to launch a fireship attack. 8 ships filled with combustibles are set alight, and the floating bombs sent in on the current toward the Spanish fleet.
And the burning ships would go in among the anchored armada, hopefully setting fire to them, but much more to the point, causing panic. And panic was caused to the Spaniards on this one occasion. Up to that point, their discipline had been tremendous, but they panicked, cut their anchor cables, and were dispersed by the wind into the North Sea.
In the morning, Medina Sidonia finds that only 5 Spanish ships remain anchored, surrounded by the entire English fleet.
This was what the English had been waiting for. They'd scattered the Armada, they'd driven them into the North Sea. Now they could throw everything they had at them.
Medina Sidonia and the ever-faithful Recalde bravely turn to face the assault. It comes with withering intensity. Medina Sidonia's galleon San Martin receives 107 direct hits on the hull, masts, and sails. The English attack at such close range, the insults can be shouted between ships.
The Spanish commander got out his grappling hooks and he hollered to the English to let him come in close and fight like men. And he said, "You're English cowards and you're Lutheran chickens. Come and fight."
Other Spanish ships return and join the fight, but to no avail. The maelstrom from the English is relentless. Blood pours from the decks of the Armada ships as more than 1,000 Spaniards are killed and 800 wounded. Amazingly, only 100 Englishmen are wounded. The assault finally ends when the English ships run out of ammunition, but the damage is already done. During the heat of battle, the strong current has pushed the crippled, scattered Spanish ships into the North Sea and away from any hope of joining up with Parma's army. Refusing to admit defeat, Medina Sidonia signals the fleet to regroup. When some ships refuse, the angry Duke has one of the offending captains hanged on the spot, leaving the body dangling from the yardarm as a warning to the others.
But what we were really surprised to find was this large heap of cannonballs, because all the historians had told us that the reason the Armada failed, or one of the reasons the Armada failed, was that they ran out of shot.
It is several years before Dr. Colin Martin uncovers the next piece in the puzzle: intact cannons. A few of the giant guns exhibit dire manufacturing defects, making them prone to explode. But all are plagued by one common problem. Dr. Martin finds that each of the hodgepodge of cannons requires a unique ball size, a terribly confusing and inefficient system when mired in the heat of battle.
The problems that the Spaniards had in getting the right shot to the right guns on board the right ships was absolutely enormous, and the reality seems to have been there was muddle on a gigantic scale, and that most of the ships actually had cannonballs of the wrong size for the cannons they had on board.
To make matters worse, further searching shows that many of the largest Spanish guns were mounted on massive two-wheeled land carriages. Such an unwieldy arrangement made them virtually impossible to move and reload during battle.
So essentially, the Spaniards had a one-off salvo, and thereafter they had great difficulty in firing again. The English, having developed mobile artillery tactics, they could load and reload throughout an action with their very compact design of sea carriage. The truck carriage was their secret weapon in 1588.
Could it be these weaknesses in Spanish weaponry that Sir Francis Drake discovered when he captured the Rosario and her captain, Don Pedro de Valdez? Was it the secret key that finally allowed the English fleet to inflict damage on the Armada at Gravelines?
Drake is a very fluent man. He speaks Spanish. Very suave, very urbane. He would have noticed that the ship, although a large ship, has guns with very, very long gun carriages, and he would have said, well, you know, how were you planning to reload them? And Don Pedro was, well, of course, we never thought of that. We thought one round, you see, and we'd come and board you. It's very interesting. Tell me more. And one can't help feeling that this extended debriefing probably provided Drake with an awful lot of information.
While Colin Martin's discovery shed new light on the mystery of why the Armada proved ineffective in battle, some experts believe that they are just symptoms of a much larger problem.
The real failure, the fundamental failure, goes back to the strategic and planning level. This is not a good plan. To expect a fleet to join up with an army 1,000 miles away in the age of sail.
Off the coast of England in the year 1707, a flotilla of warships returns home from battling the French. Suddenly, 4 of the ships smash into a hidden shoal of rocks. They sink in minutes. Nearly 2,000 men die in the catastrophe. And all because the sailors didn't have a trustworthy clock. A clock that could have told them where they were. A longitude clock. Latitude, your distance north or south of the equator, is easy to calculate using the positions of the stars. But the stars can't help you calculate longitude, the measure of how far east or west you are. And at sea, you need both coordinates to know exactly where you are. Even the great early explorers didn't know their longitude at sea. When Columbus set out, he just pointed his ships west across the Atlantic and sailed till he bumped into land. And so it was no surprise that these early voyagers got lost.
Prolonged voyages were very expensive. The crew would die of scurvy and other diseases, and the merchants wouldn't get their goods as quickly, and very often there would be shipwreck.
Then, in 1707, when the 4 British warships led by the flagship Association slammed into a reef 25 miles off the English coast, the cost in lives became too great. As a result, the British government created the so-called Board of Longitude. Then they put forth a challenge. The first person who could show the board a reliable method of calculating longitude at sea would win £20,000, millions of dollars in today's money. John Harrison spent almost 50 years of his life trying to claim that prize. Harrison was a clock-making wizard from the north of England, and he knew that the secret of figuring out longitude was hidden in the tick-tock of a timekeeper.
set a clock to a local time and take that clock with you wherever you went on your voyage.
Wait a minute. What's all this about clocks? Well, it's like time zones.
Let's imagine we have a ship docked in Greenwich, England. It's midday, 12 o'clock noon. On board the ship, they have a clock. They set it to 12 o'clock. The ship travels westward to the New World. Several days later, they look up into the sky. It's midday, 12 o'clock. But the clock says 6 o'clock. Knowing that each hour represents 15 degrees, they know now that they are 90 degrees west of their starting point, Greenwich, England.
But for this clock method to work, the timekeeper in question had to be extraordinarily accurate. Harrison would have to be able to build a clock that would lose no more than a couple of seconds each day on an official test voyage from England to the Caribbean. And that's in spite of the constant rolling of the ship and the sharp changes in temperature and moisture. No such clock had ever been built. Most people thought it was impossible. But Harrison embraced the challenge. And 5 years later, he finished his first longitude clock known as H1. It weighed 75 pounds, and on a preliminary test, it passed with flying colors.
But for Harrison, it didn't work good enough. So what did he do? He decided to make timekeeper number 2. Did it work? Well, he never even bothered trying it out because he had an idea for another timekeeper. And this time, his third timekeeper, he spent 19 years on. He was a total perfectionist.
In fact, by the time Harrison finished the third clock, he had also built his fourth, which was just as accurate, but much smaller, and about the size of a large pocket watch. But by this time, the Board of Longitude was tired of his delays and his perfectionism. Many on the Board of Judges had high hopes for a system based on the position of the moon. Harrison tested his fourth clock in 1761. It performed wonderfully. But the board still didn't want to give Harrison the award. Harrison's relationship with the judges was so strained that in 1766 the board took all 4 clocks away from him. Only after the intervention of England's King George III did Harrison get a big prize, a special award of almost 9,000 pounds. No one ever claimed the original prize money of all 20,000 pounds. But Harrison's timekeepers won in the end. Within a few years of the designer's death in 1776, any shipowner could buy a knockoff Harrison clock at a reasonable price. Most captains liked to carry more than one. By the middle of the 1800s, the British Navy had 4 times as many longitude clocks as it had ships. The original clocks were stored in the Royal Observatory in Greenwich.
And unfortunately, the basement was damp. They remained there for about 60 years until a subsequent astronomer royal discovered them and thought, this is dreadful that we have some historical artifacts rotting here, and sent them to a clockmaker in London. The clockmaker said around 1840, I can't do much to it, I'll just clean it a bit, and sent it back. And then they went back into another damp area where they rotted away.
It wasn't until 1920 that a young naval officer offered to clean them. The task would become his life's chief accomplishment and would take 12 years in all. The first 3 clocks are still in working condition, but H4, Harrison's biggest triumph, does not function. In order to prevent any further deterioration, the clock's curators do not wind it. H4 ticks no longer. John Harrison's timekeepers remain in the collection of the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England.